So good afternoon. My name is Sandeep. I'm a faculty member at the Department of ECE IISc Bangalore. I welcome you all to this third webinar from the department. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael Bronstein, who is going to give the today's seminar. So let me begin by thanking Michael for agreeing to deliver this talk. Michael Bronstein is a professor at Imperial College London, where he holds the chair in machine learning and pattern recognition, and he also heads the graph learning research at Twitter. He also heads the ML project. It's a collaborative project. It's a TED Adjacency prize-winning collaboration aimed at understanding communication of sperm whales, a very interesting project. Michael received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD all from Technion in Israel. He received his PhD in 2007, and he has held visiting appointments at many places, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Tel Aviv, TU Munich, and Princeton. So Michael is also a recipient of 5 ERC grants, faculty awards from Google and Amazon AWS. He is a member of Academia Europa, fellow of IEEE, IAPR, and a member of ELIS and ACM distinguished speaker. And he is also a World Economic Forum young scientist. So Michael has a very interesting profile. Next to his academic career, he is also a serial entrepreneur. Is a founder of multiple startup companies, including Nova, InVision, which was acquired by Intel in 2012, Video Cities, and Fabula AI, acquired by Twitter, where he also currently heads the graph learning research. He was also working at Intel before as a principal engineer at Intel Perpetual Computing, and was one of the key developers of Intel RealSense technology. So today, Michael is going to talk about geometric deep learning and some of the applications of geometric deep learning. Looking forward to your talk, Michael. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for this nice introduction. So I would like to start a little bit far away. So I will start with taking you back to the 19th century, which turned out to be extremely fruitful for the field of geometry. And as you know, geometry probably dates back at least to the ancient Greeks, with Euclid that laid the foundations of the geometry that existed for over 2,000 years. And then in the 19th century, with the works of Lobachevsky, Bolyai, Gauss, Riemann, an entire zoo of new geometries was born. Basically, geometries where the parallel postulates do not hold, and geometries that can be realized on elliptic or hyperbolic surfaces. And this led even to the question of what is geometry, because these fields rapidly diverged into completely siloed topics. And mathematicians of that time asked what actually defines a geometry. And that was a big open question, big problem, until came Felix Klein, who was at a very young age of 20-something years of age, appointed a full professor at small Bavarian university in the city of Erlangen. And where in the 1872, he was asked to deliver an inaugural talk presenting his research program, which entered into the history of mathematics as the Erlangen program. And in this research proposal, he suggested a radically different approach to geometry. Instead of studying geometry as some kind of construction that lands out of nowhere, he suggested to study it as to look at it as a study of invariants, so properties that are preserved under a certain class of transformations. And this way, for example, Euclidean geometry can be formulated as the structures that are preserved under rigid motions, rotations and translations. And we know that many such structures are preserved, such as angles, distances, areas. Affine geometry, for example, will be all the structures that are preserved under affine transformations. So we know that areas, for example, are not preserved, but parallel lines are. And projective geometry, which is the most general one, basically very little is preserved. So the rigorous formulation of these structures came from group theory, and this way you could also show which geometry is more general. And in his view, that was the projective geometry, and in essence, it was a kind of algebraization of geometry that repeated the earlier results of Descartes on a different level, and it had a really profound impact in all the areas of mathematics, also in mathematical physics. And you probably know about the Noether theorem that states that conservation laws have associated symmetries in the corresponding Lagrangians describing the physical systems. And this is a completely groundbreaking result in physics, if you think of it, that previously conservation laws were derived completely experimentally. So you would observe 1,000 times that, let's say, energy is preserved in an experiment, and then you would conclude that indeed energy is preserved. But there is no any mathematical principle that will tell you why this is the case. So with Noether's theorem that argues that because of symmetry of time, because of shift invariance, you will obtain preservation of energy automatically. It stems from this symmetry. And this is a very big deal, and all modern physics is formulated in this way. So you may ask, what does it have to do with deep learning? So geometric deep learning, in my view, and this is a view that is shared by other colleagues in the community, is an attempt to do geometrization of machine learning. And today I would like to talk about the foundations, the current challenges, and possible future development of this field. So let me start with very early neural networks. We are talking about deep learning, so well, nowadays neural networks are a vehicle that is used to implement machine learning systems. So let's talk about this very simple neural network that is probably at least 50 years old. The perceptron due to Rosenblatt in the 50s. Basically, it takes an input, a vector that you note here by x, multiplies it by the weights that are learnable parameters of the network that are denoted by w, sums everything up, and passes the result through a nonlinear activation function, such as the sine or the hyperbolic tangent. So this is a very simple neural network, but it seems to be rather powerful. If we just concatenate two such units in sequence, we have what is called the multilayer perceptron. We can approximate step functions. Once we are able to approximate step functions, we can approximate anything we want. So we say that multilayer perceptrons are universal approximators because they can approximate a continuous function to any desired accuracy. And this is a result from the 80s or the 90s to Sebenko and Hornig. So it seems like a good property, right? So multilayer perceptrons are very expressive, but actually it's if you try to apply these simple neural networks to high-dimensional data that has underlying geometric structures, such as images in computer vision problems, you see that they usually miserably fail. And this was one of the reasons why deep neural networks, or neural networks in general, fell out of favor in the 60s or the 70s. And here's an example of a simple problem of digit classification. The way that you would represent the signal to pass it into a neural network, you will just stack it into, let's say, a column vector. And the problem with this representation that it doesn't account for the geometric structure of the image at all. So it breaks it completely into one-dimensional vector. Now, if I just move the same image by 1 pixel, I will get a completely different input to the neural network. And as a result, it will struggle a lot to learn that these shifted versions of the same image must produce the same output. So you will need to learn these shift invariants from the data. And we know that the number of samples that we need to provide to learn a continuous function grows exponentially with the dimension. This is one of the consequences of a statistical or geometric phenomenon that we call the curse of dimensionality. And as a result, it doesn't work, simply. So the attempt to mend this problem came from research in neuroscience, the seminal works of Rubel and Wiesel on the visual cortex, which showed the way that the neural cells are wired, that also brought them the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1981, were first implemented by Fukushima in his neocognitron paper, where he argued that we need to share the weights And he introduced also some early versions of pooling. And the culmination of these ideas came in the classical paper of Jan McCann and co-authors, the convolutional neural networks. So if we look at convolutional neural networks, they have the following ingredients. So they take advantage of self-similar structures at different scales. They use local operations by sharing the weights. And it's a combination of shift equivariant convolutional filters. We'll talk in a second about what exactly does it mean, what I mean by shift equivariance, that are combined with pooling that provides approximate shift invariance. So computationally, importantly, the number of parameters is independent on the input size, it's order of 1, and the complexity is linear. So this is one of the reasons why these methods are so popular, and they're really the battle horse of computer vision and image analysis nowadays. So if you look at the early neural networks, the universal approximators, multilayer perceptrons, and convolutional neural networks, you can actually attribute the success of these modern neural networks, convolutional neural networks, to this deliberate departure from generality towards problem-specific inductive bias. And this is translation invariance. You can generalize this translation invariance to other group operations. So you can think of shift as operation of a group, and then you can argue that similar properties can be obtained by, for example, invariance or equivariance to rotations. And this was a series of works from the group of Max Welling that tried to generalize convolutional neural networks to other group operations. Now, let me show you a very different type of data. So this is a molecular graph. If you wonder, this is a molecule of caffeine, which I guess we are all familiar with very intimately. And this is a graph, right? So here nodes represent atoms and edges represent chemical bonds. Let's say that I want to predict some chemical or physical property of this molecule, such as the atomization energy. So I could do the same thing that I did with images. I will just collect the node-wise features, stack them into a vector, and pass it into a neural network. The problem now that any permutation of the nodes will result in a valid input. So you see that in case of images, it was shifts. Now we need to deal with a different type of invariance. And it appears that graph structured data is very common and becoming probably increasingly more prominent. Perhaps neural social networks are the most common example, where we can talk about gigantic graphs such as Twitter or Facebook, follow graphs which have hundreds of millions or even billions of users, and the edges represent their relations and interactions. But we also encounter them in biological problems such as interactomes or interaction networks that model how biomolecules in our body interact with each other and maybe with other molecules such as drugs. In computer graphics and vision, we work with graphs with some extra structure, what is called simplicial complexes, probably the simplest of which are triangular meshes, and many other examples where graphs are prominent. So in a sense, graphs are very ubiquitous objects because these are mathematical abstractions of systems of relations and interactions. And in 2017, actually a bit earlier, we wrote a paper that we titled Geometric Deep Learning with Jan McCann, Joan Brunner, Arthur Schramm, and Pierre van der Kains, where we tried to bridge some disparate works that existed in the community of graph signal processing, in network science, and also in differential geometry and computer graphics, trying to bring them under the same umbrella, which we called Geometric Deep Learning. And maybe by modern standards, it was a little bit naive paper. I would write it very differently now. But it had a lot of follow-up. So many works that try to consider this new type of relational inductive biases, in particular on graphs, graph representation learning using graph neural networks. So the prototypical objects that we considered in this paper were manifolds in graphs. And in a sense, it's hard to imagine more different entities than manifolds in graphs, right? Even if you consider the people that study them, so manifolds are studied by differential geometers, and graphs are studied by graph theorists or computer scientists. Usually these people even not sit in the same building or sit on different floors, don't go to the same conferences, maybe even silently hate each other. And nevertheless, I hope I will convince you today that, at least from some perspectives, there is a lot of similarity between these objects. So I will start with and mainly focus on graphs. I will say, if I have time, a few words about manifolds, but it's convenient to think of graphs as, again, as some abstraction of relations or interactions between some objects that we model as the nodes of the graph. So if you look at images and compare them to graphs, we see a few similarities, but a few differences. So one striking difference is that in an image, when I take a patch of pixels, I always have a constant number of neighbors. And even more, these neighbors can be ordered in some canonical order. So I can talk about a pixel to the left or a pixel to the right? In graphs, first of all, the number of neighbors can be very different. And second, we usually don't have any canonical ordering of these pixels. So as a result, the kind of invariance that we will get in these problems will be very different. And what I would like to cover today is how to design convolution type filtering operations on graphs. I will say a few words about pooling and also talk primarily about how to make these operations efficiently, something that was key for the success of deep learning in other applications, in particular in computer vision. So let me start with convolution. So I believe that everyone here is somewhat familiar with this notion, but nevertheless, when at least I was an undergraduate student and I did my, as Sandeep mentioned, I did my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, so we had a lot of signal processing courses, and I was always disturbed by the fact that convolution just lends out of nowhere, right? So it's given to you either as an integral or as a sum. You can think of it as a kind of sliding window operation, but nobody really explains why convolution, why it has this spatial structure and not something else, right? So apparently it comes out of the blue without too much motivation. So I hope to explain today actually how to derive convolution from first principles. So let's look at convolution from the perspective of convolutional neural networks. So essentially you can think of the linear part of the convolutional layer, right, without the nonlinear activation. It's a linear mapping from the input to the output that can be represented as a matrix. So first of all, the input is sparsely connected to the output. So you will usually have just a few inputs that that produce a single output. And the way that the output is structured, it's a linear combination of the inputs with shared parameters. So if I write it as a matrix, it will have this constant multi-diagonal structure. Okay. Now, this is a very special matrix. It is formed by shifted versions of a fixed vector. So we need to provide some boundary conditions, and it's convenient to think of periodic boundary conditions. So it's shift with wraparounds. Okay, so I take this vector W, and I shift it by one position each time, and I append them, creating this matrix. So we call such matrices circulant matrices, and they're an equivalent representation of convolutions. So I can talk about circulant matrices or convolutions synonymously. Now, one thing that you learn in linear algebra courses is that matrices do not commute. Their multiplication of A by B is not the same usually as B by A, right? But circulant matrices are very special matrices. They do commute. And in particular, if we pick one circulant matrix, which is the shift operator, as what is shown here, denoted by S, this is a very special matrix. It shifts the elements of a vector by one position, again with modulo n wraparound. Okay, so convolution commutes with shift. We call this property shift equivariance. Equivariance means that the result changes the same way. So if I apply first the shift and then the convolution, it will be the same as first applying the convolution and then shift, as opposed to invariance, which means that the result is not affected by the operation. Okay, so what else do we know about the commuting matrices? We know that they are jointly diagonalizable. They have the same eigenspace, or in this case, the same eigenvectors. And basically, because of this property, we can pick up any of the circulant matrices and look at its eigenvectors. All the other circulant matrices will have exactly the same eigenvectors, though different eigenvalues. And it's convenient to look at the shift. So for shift, we can actually analytically compute its eigenvectors. And surprise, surprise, we discover that these are the sines or cosines or the complex exponentials that form the standard Fourier basis. So if you ever wondered where the Fourier basis comes from, it comes from the diagonalization of the shift operator. There are several other ways of deriving it, but it's an orthogonal basis that diagonalizes the shift. Okay. So what it means that we can diagonalize certain matrices or convolutions by the discrete Fourier transform, and this is exactly what we do. So we can write the circular matrix as a diagonal matrix in this Fourier basis. So the last bit of information that I need to tell you is that the eigenvalues of this matrix will be given by the Fourier transform of the spectral W that forms it. So that's all that we need to get to what we call the convolution theorem, which is a cornerstone of signal processing that tells us that we can compute convolution in two dual and completely equivalent ways. We can think of it as a circulant matrix in the spatial domain, or we can first apply the discrete Fourier transform, do element-wise product, equivalently product by a diagonal matrix of the Fourier coefficients of the filter, and then the inverse Fourier transform. And the results will be the same, right? And if you think of it, this is really bread and butter of signal processing. Usually you design the filter already in the frequency domain and you just do the Fourier transform of the signal. So let me summarize again what we've seen so far. I guess this is just a recap of what you already know. So convolution in spatial domain is a circulant matrix. You can think of it as local aggregation on adjacent nodes with shared parameters, and its spatial structure, it comes from the underlying grid. On the other hand, we see that all circulant matrices are diagonalized by the discrete Fourier transform, which happens to be the eigenvectors of the shift, and therefore we can do convolution in the frequency domain. We can apply DFT, then element-wise product of the filter with the signal, and then the inverse DFT. So we can compute it efficiently using a fast Fourier transform algorithm in n log n operations, or if the filter is small, we just think of it as a sliding window with order of n operations. Okay, so let's now go from grids to graphs. And just a recap, what is a graph? This is a collection of nodes that we index from 1 to n. The edges are either ordered pairs of nodes, in this case the graph is said to be directed, or unordered, in this case the graph is undirected. We can talk about the neighborhood of the node, which is just a set of nodes that are connected by an edge to it, and the size of the neighborhood is called the degree. Now, we will be usually talking about attributed graphs where we have some node features that we represent by an n by d dimensional matrix, where d is the dimension of the features. We can also talk about edge features, or in particular case, we can say that the graph is just weighted, so it's positive scalars that are attached to each edge. And the structure of the graph can be represented by the adjacency matrix, where at position ij we have a value that represents the weight of the edge, and 0 if there is no edge. Okay. And one thing to observe, that if the graph is undirected, then the adjacency matrix is symmetric. We'll see in a second why this is important. Another prominent construction that you will encounter in graph theory and in signal processing of graphs is the graph Laplacian. So the graph Laplacian, think of it as a local difference operator. So what it does, it averages the features of the nodes that are adjacent to node I, so in the neighborhood around I, and then subtracts this average from the value of the feature at the node itself. And in matrix vector notation, you can write it as this matrix that its identity minus the adjacency normalized by the degree matrix, where degree is the diagonal matrix containing the degree of the nodes at each position. And another important association quantity that is called the Dirichlet energy, it measures how smooth the signal is on the graph. So it basically tells you, it's a quadratic form that tells you how different you are from the average of your neighbors. And if the signal is smooth, it means that when I go to my neighbors, the signal doesn't change too much. I should say that the Laplacian is really a workhorse in a lot of fields, and you will encounter it ubiquitously in equations of mathematical physics. You can define it on many different objects. You can define it on manifolds. In differential geometry, we call this the Laplace-Beltrami operator. You can discretize it on meshes using, for example, the cotangent formula. You can define it even on metric spaces. So it is a very common construction. Now, how do we do convolution on graphs? So we've seen two ways, right? We have the spatial version as a local aggregation with shared parameters, or the frequency domain using some analogy of the Fourier transform. So allow me to start with the later one, with the graph Fourier transform. Okay, and for this purpose, let us again take a step back and look at the one-dimensional grid as a graph. So because we assume periodic boundary conditions, we can think of our grid as a ring graph, right? Where I connect each node to a subsequent one and then the first node to the last one. So if you look at the adjacency matrix of this graph, it looks very familiar, right? So this is exactly the shift operator that we've seen before. So the adjacency matrix of ring graph is the shift operator. And the key idea of generalizing the Fourier transform from grids to graphs is to use the eigenvectors of the adjacency matrix or of the graph Laplacian or other similar matrices as the analogy of the Fourier transform. So the two things are equivalent on grids, right? Because they are all circulant matrices, so they all have the same eigenvectors, but they are slightly different on graphs. So there are different papers in the literature that use either the adjacency matrix or the graph. The graph Laplacian, the results will be slightly different, but the principle is the same. So for undirected graphs, the adjacency matrix and the Laplacian have orthogonal eigenvectors, and it is very convenient, therefore, to think of them as a direct extension of the Fourier transform. For directed graphs, the construction is more elaborate and allow me not to dive into these details. Okay, so this is how the Fourier transform looks like for the ring graph. So this is the classical cosine or sine basis, and this is how it will look on the graph, right? So here you can see the first eigenvectors of some rod network graph Laplacian. So you see that the first, for example, the first eigenvector is constant. This is what signal processing people call the DC component. The corresponding eigenvalue is 0. And as we go to higher eigenvalues, usually we order the eigenvectors in increasing order of their eigenvalues. We see more oscillations, changes from negative to positive numbers. And actually, we can regard the eigenvalues as frequencies. That's exactly what we see in the sines and cosines, for example. So here's a recipe for spectral graph convolution. So to compute the convolution of x with w, we will apply the graph Fourier transform by multiplying x by the matrix of eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian or the graph adjacency matrix, right? So this is the projection on the Fourier basis, which gives us the Fourier coefficients. Then we apply the filter by element-wise or diagonal matrix product, and then inverse graph Fourier transform. Okay, so far it's exactly the same as we've seen before. So here come the first pieces of bad news, right? The complexity of computing the graph Fourier transform is order of n squared, because we need to multiply by a dense matrix of size n by n, and we don't have this redundancy that allows, in the Euclidean case, to do a fast Fourier transform. And I'm not even mentioning the cost of computing the eigenvectors, which will cost us probably slightly less than order of n cubed. Then application of the filter is linear, and the inverse Fourier transform is also quadratic. So to compare this to the classical Euclidean case, where we had order of n or n log n in the worst case. Now, another bad piece of news is that the number of parameters is order of n, right? So these are the coefficients that we see in this diagonal matrix W. So this is opposed to order of 1, independent of the input size in the classical convolutional neural networks. And there are a few other nasty things, like no guarantee of spatial localization. So we design our filter in the frequency domain. We don't know how it will look like on the in the domain of the nodes of the graph. The filters are isotropic. There is no sense of direction. And this has to do with the fact that on grids, we can actually write the Laplacian and the resulting Fourier basis as tensor products of one-dimensional Laplacians and one-dimensional bases. So we have a natural way of decomposing frequencies into different dimensions. So we have horizontal and vertical frequency images. In graphs, it's not clear how to order the eigenvalues rather than in their increasing order. So the eigenspace, the frequency, the geometry of the frequency domain is one-dimensional. And finally, probably the worst of all is that filters are basis dependent and they don't generalize across graphs. So let me visualize the later property by this example. So here we have a graph or a mesh that represents these forests, and there is a signal that defines ones in the red regions and zeros in the gray regions. So I apply a spectral filter to the signal and I do some kind of edge detection by computing the Fourier transform, multiplying by the filter, and computing the inverse Fourier transform. I will now deform this graph a little bit. by still keeping the same filter coefficients. And what would you expect to see in this case? So the underlying graph will change, the Laplacian will change, the eigenvectors will change, the filter is kept the same. And if you apply it nevertheless to the new basis, you will get completely different results, because eigenvectors are unstable under perturbations of the domain. So if I learned my filters on one graph and I try to apply them to a new one, it will not work, it will not generalize. Now, the second thing that I mentioned about isotropy of the filters on the graphs is the following thing that I already mentioned. On the grid, we have canonical order of the neighbors. I can talk about the neighbor to the left or the neighbor to the right. On the graph, we can permute our neighbors in any way we want. There is no canonical ordering. So basically, we have permutation invariance or ambiguity to under local permutations. And this is to say that there is no direction on graphs. And when we define the Laplacian, for example, because it averages over the entire neighborhood, averaging is a permutation invariant operation. As a result, the filters that we get are isotropic. I should say that on meshes or on discrete manifolds, the situation is much more optimistic because meshes are locally Euclidean. So there we have an ambiguity of how to select one of the nodes, but once we select it, we can order all the rest of them in some canonical way, for example, in clockwise direction. So instead of permutation ambiguity, we have a rotation ambiguity. And this allows us to define anisotropic filters on meshes, where we can say that the heat or the information propagates faster in certain directions. Okay, so let's have a second look at the convolution that we can define on graphs. And let's think of it as a matrix function that is applied to our Laplacian or the adjacency matrix. And we can interpret the eigenvalues, as I said, as frequencies. And in this case, the function, which we apply in the operator sense, we apply to the eigenvalues of the matrix, we can think of it as a spectral transfer function. And if we make it parametric with fixed number of parameters, we get rid of one of the problems that the number of parameters was dependent on the input size. And if we make it expressible in terms of simple matrix operations, such as powers or matrix vector multiplications, you can see that we don't even need to explicitly compute the eigenvectors of the matrix. And it is also possible to guarantee stability under graph perturbations. So we have the theorem with Ron-Levy, where we prove it. And it is also possible to guarantee some form of localization, either compact support or some form of exponential decay. And here's the simplest choice, polynomial. So the number of parameters here is order of 1. These are the coefficients of the polynomial. And the efficient computation, we just need to take the powers of our matrix and apply it to a vector. And because usually this matrix will be sparse, this will be efficient. So the cost we'll pay will be as proportional to the number of edges in the graph, which, if the graph is sparsely connected, roughly as the number of nodes. And also because the Laplacian is localized, it touches only the neighbors of a node, the power p of the Laplacian will touch only p times removed neighbors. So as a result, the filters will be localized to p hops on the graph. And we can show that it generalizes across different graphs, so it's stable under the perturbations of the graph. You can use it with any other operations. Operators, instead of the Laplacian, you can use the adjacency matrix, for example. It doesn't really matter here whether the matrix is symmetric, because we are not doing anymore an explicit eigendecomposition. And as a result, for example, you can apply these operations to directed graphs. So that was the spectral graph convolution. Let's talk about spatial graph convolution, and we'll see that actually the two things are completely identical in some sense. So again, recall the one-dimensional grid. So we represent it as a ring graph, and we've seen that the adjacency matrix is exactly the shift operator. Now, if I think of the convolution, basically it's this matrix with multiple diagonals, you can think of it as a linear weighted combination of the powers of the shift, right? Or equivalently the adjacency matrix. So we can write convolution in this form as W naught I, or the a to the power 0, plus W1 a to the power 1, W2 a to the power 2, and so on, right? So that's exactly the polynomial filter that we've seen before. So here we came from a different consideration from the spatial domain, and we see that it's completely equivalent to the spectral filtering that we've seen before, that is implemented as a transfer function. So instead of the Laplacian, here we use the adjacency matrix. And this gives rise to probably the simplest way of doing convolution on graphs, which is called the graph convolutional networks, a work you keep van Welling. And if we look at the matrix of features, we can arrange it into n by d matrix, as I said before. Each row represents the d-dimensional feature vector of a node. So we can do two things to these features. We can transform them node-wise, in the simplest case, just by linear transformation, so multiplication from the right by this green matrix. And we can also diffuse the features on the graph. So I multiply by some diffusion matrix, which can be the adjacency or the Laplacian, that mixes together features from adjacent nodes. And then I can apply nonlinearity, such as the half rectifier, and I get one convolutional layer on the graph. And I can combine multiple such layers, and this is an example of a two-layer graph convolutional network that does node-wise classification. Okay, so going back to our beginning, we've seen that in images we have convolutions, on graphs we have an analogy of convolution that exchanges information with the neighbor nodes. We call this message passing. In images, we use local operations in a sliding window. On graphs, these are local operations in one hop. The differences are that we don't have a constant number of neighbors and their ordering is arbitrary, so we have different kinds of invariants, but the good news that we can do it with linear complexity as before. So let me say a few words about pooling. And in images, pooling is just reducing the dimensionality of the image. In graphs, pooling is a kind of graph coarsening, so we can collapse, for example, the nodes along edges that connect them, and compute a sequence of coarser graphs where we pool the features on the respective nodes. And we can interleave, like in classical convolutional networks, the convolutional and pooling layers. The different thing, though, that we can learn the pooling that will be optimal for the downstream task. This is typically not done in Euclidean convolutional neural networks. Now, the recipe that we've seen for convolutional graphs is really the simplest one, because we can think of it as some fixed matrix that can be parameterized by certain parameters, but independent on the features that is applied to our feature vector or feature matrix. And this is how the early graph convolutional networks work, like so the ChebNet that we've seen with polynomials, GCN or its variants. We can make the matrix, the diffusion, still linear, but now the coefficients of this diffusion matrix A can be made dependent on the features. So this is, for example, the graph attention networks or the mixture model networks that were done by my PhD student, Federico Monti. And if you think of graph attention, if you're familiar with nonlinear filters such as bilateral filter or non-homogeneous or anisotropic diffusion that were popular about 20 years ago in PD-based image processing, so that's exactly the same idea. So you learned how to mix information from different nodes of the graph based on how similar these feature vectors are in different nodes. So it's a kind of position-dependent filtering. And finally, everything can be made nonlinear. So you have a general operator that in a nonlinear way aggregates information from your local neighborhood. And this is the most general form of graph neural networks, what is called message passing neural networks. And you can think of it as two operations. So you aggregate information from your neighbors, and here you can incorporate anything you want. So you can incorporate also edge features, for example. And you also have the, once you aggregated this information, you update the feature of your node. And you do it for each node of the graph. Now, the aggregation must be permutation invariant. So it can be, for example, the maximum sum or the mean, the typical aggregation operations. And it appears that the choice of this aggregation operation is extremely important. So if we look at these structures, so here we are updating the black node in the center, and let's say that we use the maximum. So the different colors represent different features. So we have two nodes with the same features that are denoted in red. They are completely undistinguishable from the simple graph, which has just one red node, so with the maximum function. But if we use mean, for example, we can distinguish between them. Now, if you look at the middle and the right graph, by means of mean, we cannot distinguish between them because each node appears twice. But if we use sum, we can distinguish. So the choice of the aggregator is extremely important, and it's probably appropriate to ask at this point the question of what is actually the expressive power of graph neural networks. And this is not an easy question because in the simple case in multi-layer perceptrons, the domain was fixed. So we can say that we pose it as a function approximation question. So we have a fixed domain. We can just ask what class of functions can these neural networks approximate. So here we need to account for the structure of the domain. And one way of doing it is to relate the expressive power of graph neural networks to the problem of graph isomorphism testing. And we say that graphs are isomorphic if there exists an age-preserving bijection between them. In other words, we can just renumber the nodes and we get the same graph. Or if you wish, you can look at the adjacency matrix and we apply some permutation to the rows and the columns. It is interesting actually that even the complexity of this problem is unknown. So we know that it's not NP hard. On the other hand, we don't know any polynomial algorithm yet for graph isomorphism testing. So usually it's put in a separate class of complexity that is called GI complexity, graph isomorphism complexity. And classical work in graph theory by Lehman and Boris Weisfeiler, two Soviet mathematicians, actually attempted to find a polynomial time graph isomorphism testing algorithm, which they genuinely first believed to be. It was disproved by a counterexample a year later. And what graph isomorphism, the WL graph isomorphism test does, it does some kind of color refinement procedure based on the neighbors. So you start with a graph that is colored, all the nodes are colored in the same way. So by color, I mean some discrete label. And then you look at the multiset of the node and its neighbor. And multiset means that it's a set where the same node can appear, the same element can appear multiple times. So you see, for example, that here we have difference between nodes which have 2 neighbors and 3 neighbors. And we hash them by an injective function, so each different multiset will get a different label in this color refinement. Then we do it again, and we see that now we have refined again the colors, but after some point, the colors will stop changing. So at this point, we will stop the algorithm and compute the histogram, the distribution of the colors. And this will be the descriptor of the graph. Now, if I do the same algorithm for a different graph, and I obtain a different distribution of colors, I can stop and for sure say that these graphs are non-isomorphic. But if I get the same distributions, I don't actually know. They are possibly isomorphic. So indeed, it's a necessary but insufficient conditions for graph isomorphism. And we see examples of graphs for which the WL test produces the same distribution of colors, but they are not isomorphic. We say that the WL test fails. And simple example is shown here. So we have a graph where we have 2 triangles, and the color refinement will produce the same result. And yet the graphs are not isomorphic. So it was shown in 2 works by Xu and Morris last year that message passing is equivalent to color refinement. So you can show that GNNs are at most as powerful as the WL test. And there are high-dimensional versions called KWL tests that use K tuples of nodes that are strictly more powerful than the simple WL test. And it is possible to derive equivalent high-dimensional graph neural networks that are non-local. The problem is that they have very high complexity, both in time and in space. So, for example, the best result that was obtained in this direction was by Hagai Maron. The neural network has cubic time complexity, so it's good for proving theorems, but it's impractical. So, what is the alternative? We can do something better. So, this is what we call graph subtraction networks. And we know that WL test cannot count even simple structures such as cliques or triangles, so let's help it. Let's count some predefined substructures of size k and provide them as a feature descriptor for each node. So if you're familiar with positional encoding in neural networks, this is a kind of positional, or better say, structural encoding for the nodes. Okay, and basically, this is added as an extra feature to the message passing, and the message passing has exactly the same linear complexity. So we retain all the nice properties of graph neural networks based on message passing, where the message passing is linear and it has local structure. All the computational complexity overhead is absorbed into the pre-computation, and in the worst case, it can be n to the power k, but for many substructures, this computation is much more efficient. So in the worst case, we are as bad as the higher order graph neural networks, but in practice, we are better. And what is important that actually, in many cases, we know a priori what structures are important. So this is a kind of problem-specific inductive bias. We can also show that we are strictly more powerful than the WL test. For example, we can also show that we are at least not less powerful than the 3WL test, the higher dimensional Weisfeiler-Lehman algorithm, by just showing a counterexample. So these are strongly irregular graphs. One of them has 4 clicks, another one has just triangles, and they're undistinguishable by means of the 3WL test that cannot count clicks. And this can be extended to k isoregular graphs that are that the KWL algorithm cannot distinguish. So we tested this approach on multiple graph datasets coming from different domains, mainly from chemistry and social networks. And we know a priori that in social networks, for example, clicks are important structures. And in chemistry, on the other hand, cycles are important. So if you look at different chemical molecules, organic molecules, you will prominently see a feature that looks like rings. So again, my favorite molecule of caffeine, it will have, for example, a 6 ring and a 5 ring. So we see that if we count these structures and pass them as inductive biases to our graph neural networks, we get a significant boost in predicting the chemical properties of these molecules. And again, this is an indication that incorporating this prior information is important. So I see that I'm almost running out of time. So let me briefly talk about what's next and what is the road ahead in geometric deep learning. So one thing that really was crucial for the success of deep learning, in particular in computer vision, is standardized benchmarks. So the ImageNet competition for image classification. We never had anything similar for graphs until recently. So last year, the Open Graph benchmark was introduced, and it is becoming the de facto standard in the community, which helps a lot organize the disparate and disorganized tests for different algorithms. Software libraries, so same thing as PyTorch and TensorFlow, democratized deep learning for everyone. We are seeing serious industry-supported libraries in geometric deep learning as well, such as PyTorch Geometric or Deep Graph Library. Efficiency and scalability. So if you want to apply graph neural networks to real problems such as dealing with Twitter or Facebook social graphs, you need to design them in such a way that they can scale to billions of edges or nodes, and they can run in real time. This is a non-trivial challenge. So it's only relatively recently that the community starts to look in this direction as well. And this is one of our key goals at Twitter, to develop algorithms that scale and can be applied efficiently to Twitter scale problems. Another characteristic of graphs that we see, for example, in social networks is that the way that they are formed is dynamic. So it's a living thing, right? So users are added to the platform or follow other users or engage with tweets, and therefore the system is dynamic. So we need to account for graphs that evolve in time. It is interesting that all or the majority of graph neural networks have so far looked at message passing type of architectures, and we know from complex networks, for example, that higher order structures such as simplicial complexes are important. So there is an interesting link to, for example, computational topology, which considers structures that go beyond graphs, such as simplexes and so on. It is interesting that in many problems we actually don't know the graph. So latent graph learning is an interesting and important problem. And there are many open questions in theoretical understanding, such as, for example, the robustness of graph neural networks, the generalization capabilities, some performance guarantees, and so on. And the last but not least problem is finding really the killer apps where these methods can have the biggest impact. And it's not surprising that graph neural networks have become one of the hottest topics in machine learning. So this is statistics from this year's ICLR conference. This was indeed the most frequent keyword in the submissions. And it's not surprising because graphs, as I said in the beginning, describe abstractly systems of relations and interactions, so you can apply them to a lot of different problems in science and engineering. And you can apply them at problems at different scales, from the macro scale, such as social networks, to micro scale, such as interactomes, interactions between different molecules, to all the way to the lowest nanoscales, modeling, for example, entire molecules as chemical graphs. And in the remaining, well, actually very little time, probably I will need another 5 minutes, let me show you a few snapshots of such applications. So I will start with social networks, and one thing that is a prominent topic in relation to social networks is misinformation, right, or so-called fake news. And there is empirical evidence that shows that fake news or non-fake news, whatever you call them and however you define them, tend to propagate differently on the social graph. And this was the cover of the Science magazine in 2018, where a group from Media Lab at MIT showed how fake news propagate on Twitter. And we use this kind of approach to try to actually learn how to distinguish between fake news and not fake news from the way that they spread in time over Twitter. And we used annotated fact-checked news as our ground truth and trained a graph neural network that was able to predict whether a story is fake or not from the way that it propagates. So this technology laid into the foundation of a startup that Sandeep mentioned in the beginning, Fabula AI, that I co-founded with my students, and we were acquired by Twitter last year. So now I work at Twitter. I had the graph learning research efforts there. So one of the problems, for example, where graph neural networks also can be used, and not only in social networks, but practically any internet content company, is recommender systems. So you can think of recommender system as an age prediction. So you have a graph of users, and let's say you want to predict whom to follow. So you can encode this graph, the nodes of the graph, represent them into some space, and then you want this representation to be indicative of the graph structure. So if two nodes are close in the embedding space, it means that there is high probability of an edge being between them. And this is how some modern recommender systems can be implemented. High energy physics, so if you think of collisions of different particles in the Large Hadron Collider, you can represent the jets of different particles that are formed as graphs. And in fact, the high energy physics community shows keen interest in graph neural networks as the next generation of these detectors are being built nowadays. I myself was involved in collaboration with the IceCube, the Neutrino Observatory, where we use graph neural networks to predict astrophysical neutrinos. And as you might know, gravitational astronomy and neutrino astronomy are the completely revolutionary next generation of the way that we try to study the universe. Now, computational chemistry is probably the field where graph neural networks are going to make the biggest impact. And drug development and drug design is the key problem. One of the challenges there that the search space is extremely large. We're talking about number of synthesizable molecules that are almost as large as the number of atoms in the universe. On the other hand, experimentally, only very few such molecules can be tested. It takes a lot of time and is extremely expensive. So somehow we need to bridge this gap by computation. We can resort to quantum mechanical simulations, to molecular dynamics, to some simplified versions such as DFT, density functional theory methods. So graph neural networks stand at the same level of DFT, being several orders of magnitude faster. And this is already old results by Justin Gilmer and co-authors from DeepMind from approximately 3 years ago. Nowadays, it's even better. And if you think that, well, one of the challenges when dealing with such problems is basically how far you are from the real world. It's a kind of spherical horse in a vacuum from the famous joke. Whether it is too simplified, but probably not anymore. I think these methods are already on the radar of pharmaceutical companies, and earlier this year there was a cover paper in the Cell from the group of Collins from MIT, where they showed the discovery of a new class of antibiotics, where the virtual screening pipeline included graph neural networks. I myself am involved in collaboration with colleagues from EPFL, where we try to use geometric deep learning for building proteins, and proteins are the next, probably the next word in the design of drugs different types of what is called biological drugs or biologics for targets that are considered to be undruggable. So usually the small molecule targets a target which has some kind of pockets or convenient binding sites. So many proteins are flat, like the program death ligands, which are the key for cancer immunotherapy. They allow the immune system to kill the cancer cells in a natural way of basically reactivating the natural course of operation of the immune system. And this was recognized by the Nobel Prize in Medicine 2 years ago. So what we try to do is to develop a kind of lock and the key analogy, use geometric deep learning to understand the geometric and chemical structures that make protein bind to each other, and then use these predictions to design proteins that can bind to certain targets. So we had a paper in Nature Methods that appeared on the cover, where we presented geometric deep learning architecture for designing computational design of de novo proteins that can target undruggable disease targets. So I will end with the last example of applications, which actually takes these ideas to a higher level of abstraction. And you can think of drugs as from the way that they interact with the interactome. So usually drugs are designed to bind to some target, which usually happens to be a protein, but proteins interact to each other as well. So we have about 20,000 proteins in our body that are encoded genetically. And once it was thought about the drug, so the conventional mindset of drug therapy is to develop one drug for one target that addresses one disease. But on average, a drug targets about 50 different targets. Some of them are side effects, and then the target also interacts with other proteins. So there is an entire network effect. And a different way to look is the so-called network medicine, to look at how these targets interact with each other, so we can consider the effect of the drug as a signal on this protein-to-protein interaction network, and we can predict whether a molecule will act as, let's say, an oncological drug from the way that it affects the interactome. And this way we trained a classifier that predicted anti-cancer drugs, and then applied it to other molecules that come from the domain of food. And you know that plant-based foods contain many molecules that come from the same biochemical classes as oncological drugs, and they're actually responsible for the usually unpleasant taste of the food. And they're actually in food processing, they're removed. So the bitter taste of, I don't know, the garlic, for example, this is something that food industries are fighting with, because people think of it as unpleasant, but actually it contains a lot of molecules that can help prevent or beat cancer. And most of these molecules are completely unknown. Most of these molecules are not tracked by nutritional databases. So on food packaging, you will see the amount of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, and maybe some microelements and vitamins, but you will not see anything about, let's say, the content of flavonoids or indoles. This is really the dark matter of nutrition. So by using machine learning, we're able to predict which foods contain these anti-cancer drug-like molecules, and we're able to see also the diversity of these molecules and construct this food map. And it actually contains many foods that are known from empirical clinical studies to have a certain anti-cancer effect. And we partnered with a molecular chef in Britain to design tasty and aesthetically appealing dishes that are used that use these hyperfoods. So in general, this is a domain that is called drug repositioning, and you can try to use existing drugs rather than developing new drug molecules to cure some diseases. For example, repurpose a drug against different disease. So one of the best examples is metformin, that was originally developed as an anti-diabetic drug, but now it is believed to extend the longevity and increase the span of life. And we can try to predict with graph neural networks the side effects of drugs or their synergies. So I'm involved in the Recover Coalition, which is funded by the Gates Foundation with Mila and Relation Therapeutic, a British pharmaceutical startup, where we try to develop combinational therapies against COVID-19. And I think I will probably stop here. I have more slides, but I'm now out of time. So just to summarize, if we go to the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the Erlangen program. So you can think of geometric deep learning as a kind of Erlangen program of deep learning, where our starting point is some invariance or symmetry that we try to incorporate as inductive biases in our architectures. And if you think of graphs in particular, there are very general abstractions. They can be used everywhere, and geometric deep learning offers deep learning models that are capable to account correctly for these structures. It is really very cross-disciplinary research, so I have the privilege to work with people that I would otherwise be probably unable even to come across, people working on proteins, and on particle physics, and clinicians, and even a chef. It is very hot field in machine learning. There are already several success stories, including in the industry, well, including several startups, some first industrial applications, and probably what is most important, many open questions. So if you are a PhD student and are considering doing a PhD in machine learning, I highly recommend you to look at problems in the domain of geometric deep learning. So at this point, I would like to give credit to many of my collaborators in the projects that I mentioned today, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael, for this very interesting talk and very nice applications. So I now open the floor for questions. So please type the questions in the chat box if there are any, and we can take a couple of questions. So in the meantime, can you tell us a bit more about how do you build this database for hyperfluids? So how do you so what exactly is involved in generation of the graph, and what are the ingredients that go into this graph?
Right. So the good thing about hyperfluids is that it's actually all open source information. So there are several graphs involved. So one of them is the protein-to-protein interaction graph. So this is something that is observed experimentally. So this is how proteins in our body interact, and well, probably up to some small mutations, we all humans as a species have the same PPI graph. So this is one thing. Then for drugs, there is a data set that actually that tells how drugs bind to their targets, and maybe also with some binding affinity. So we have this signal of the binding on the graph. Then we have the same thing for other molecules that are contained in food. And finally, there is the food DB, which tells us which molecules are contained in different foods. And that's how we can, first of all, train a classifier to predict anti-cancer drug-like molecules, then predict which other molecules that are not FDA-approved drugs would be drug-like, and then we can map them to the ingredients in the foods. Of course, there are many open questions. So one of them is, for example, different interactions between these molecules. So this is something that is currently not fully understood, and it is possible. Well, I mentioned briefly the work from Stanford on the side effects of drugs. So side effects are examples of negative interactions. The interactions can also be synergistic. So they can be positive. And one example is, for example, some molecules in apples have anti-cancer properties. But if you remove the outside part of the apple, that actually usually comes with bitter taste, then the effect is significantly reduced. So it's probably a combination of multiple molecules that act in synergy that makes it work.
Mm-hmm. And also, I know that so there are interactions between foods and drugs, similar to side effects of two drugs. So you can also have say when you're taking certain medicine, you're not supposed to take alcohol and so on, right? So are there any works in predicting these indications of interactions between drugs and foods?
Yeah, so that's exactly what we are currently working on with my collaborators from Imperial College, from the Faculty of Medicine. So we are in particular looking at antiviral effects. Well, obviously, the target is COVID-19, so we are looking at drug and food molecule interactions. Yes.
Actually,
so that's. I hope that soon we'll have some, maybe some at least computational insights about how this works. Yeah, I see there are some questions.
Right. So I can read it out for you. So I'm pretty interested in the rest of your presentation on 3D computer graphics as I work as. Okay, so I read the part of this question from Ranadeep. I'm pretty interested to see the rest of your presentation on 3D computer graphics as I work as a GPU designer. Is there a way I can see that? So perhaps I think his question is, are the slides available? The rest of the talk where you skip past. So
yeah, I the slides available, and maybe just to briefly answer this question. So for 3D data, for 3D computer graphics, you can think of 3D data in two different ways, right? So 3D objects are their realizations. You can think of them as Euclidean data, right? So let's say point cloud or some surface that lives in 3D space, and you can in principle apply standard convolutional neural networks, maybe with three-dimensional filters to them. The problem, of course, that these methods are not invariant to anything, right? So even if you rotate the object in the system of coordinates, you will get different results. So the idea of geometric deep learning, you build the filters on the surfaces themselves. So same way as we did convolutions on graphs, you can build convolutions on meshes with the extra advantage that they have more structure. So we can make them, for example, deformation invariant. And this way, it depends on the problem, of course. But if you want, let's say, deformation invariant correspondence, then you would be able to do it with way less parameters, because it's an inductive bias that is built into the architecture. So you don't need to learn these invariants from the data. And we show that we can use orders of magnitude less data, train much faster with much more lightweight architectures. So the more interesting problems are the problems of synthesis, how to generate new 3D shapes. And we've done work on this as well. So if you assume there are difficult and very difficult instances of this problem. So the less difficult one is when you assume that the object comes from the same class. So let's say you have hands or faces or human bodies, and you can assume that the connectivity exists. So you're trying to predict just the embedding, the geometry, the positions of the nodes, but not redo the connectivity. And with my students, we've done some good work. So one of them was actually in collaboration with a startup company that does 3D avatars, and they showed that you can synthesize hands from 2D images. So it's a hybrid architecture where the encoder is a 2D convolutional neural network. The decoder that generates the object is a mesh convolutional neural network. So in real time, on an iPhone, about 10 times faster than real time, in about 200 frames per second, you're able to synthesize hands from basically in the wild, so with occlusions. And these hands are difficult objects because there are many degrees of freedom and there is a lot of occlusions. So geometric deep learning in this case provides a very strong inductive bias. Yeah, I hope this answers the question. So I think.
So the next question is, will deep learning introduce new algebra?
I'm not sure how this question. So I don't think that it will introduce new algebra, but it builds on ideas that exist in geometry probably for around 100 years. So again, how to use symmetry. So if you approach it in the same way that Klein approached geometric construction as the study of invariants, so you can think that, for example, in convolutional neural networks, we have shift invariants. In general group equivariant neural networks, we have invariants to groups or equivariants to groups. In graphs, this is permutation invariant. Same thing on sets. So, there is another interesting thing that I didn't mention. So learning on point clouds, for example, this is learning on sets. So you can think of it as an empty graph with no edges. So there you have global permutation invariants. And on manifolds, you can use actually ideas from high energy physics. So that was that was work from Max Welling and Taco Point. They constructed what they call gauge equivariant neural networks, where by gauge it's a local transformation of coordinates. You can parameterize the local filters in a way that they are invariant to the choice of the local system of coordinates. I don't think it's a new algebra, but it's a new use of old tools. That's what it is.
So, there were two more questions related to scalability. So I read one of them. I wanted to know how can the scalability issue be solved, and can graph neural nets be used to tackle higher dimensional visualizations?
Right. So the scalability. Well, one of the issues with scalability, well, obviously the size of the graph. Now, the second thing is that really, it is let's say what really works in production. And if you look at when let's say companies say that they use deep learning in production systems, in most cases it will be something like multi-layer perceptrons. So you can apply them to, let's say, individual nodes of the graph. Now, the diffusion, the propagation is challenging because, first of all, you have different number of neighbors. So first of all, you need to do some kind of sampling on the graph. So we did the work on and basically different approaches to scalability. Do some kind of sampling and aggregation approaches. What we try to do with work that we did at Twitter is to take ideas to the extreme. So one of the key questions, for example, in graph neural networks, is trying to understand whether deep neural networks are at all useful. And this is not an obvious thing because there are several phenomena, such as the bottleneck phenomenon, and it is not unique to graphs, but it is particularly prominent in graphs, especially when the graphs have exponential growth of neighbors. So you end up with a lot of features that you need to squeeze into a single feature vector by means of message passing. And this makes message passing inefficient, especially when you have long distance relations, when you need to propagate information from distant nodes. Now, in deep learning in general, let's say in convolutional neural networks, there is always this argument: do I need to use a shallow architecture with big filters, or small filters but deeper architecture? And in computer vision, the community clearly favored small filters, even as low as 1-to-1, basically the one-by-one convolution, with very deep architectures. And if you compare, let's say, the first modern architectures such as AlexNet, they used 11-by-11 filters, but only, I think, 6 convolutional layers. If you go just take architectures from a few years after, they used 3-by-3 filters with maybe 50 layers. So the community clearly voted for small filters, deep networks. In graph neural networks, it seems that it is more difficult to build deeper architectures. For a variety of reasons. The information bottleneck is one of them. And another thing that is possible in traditional convolutional neural networks is what is called compositionality. So you can build complex features from simple ones. So if you look at how the filters in convolutional neural networks look like, the first layers will build something like edge detectors or corner detectors. And as you go deeper, you will detect more complex geometric structures, up to what is called jokingly the grandmother neuron, which will be one neuron that detects the face of your particular grandmother. Now, in graphs, this is not necessarily possible. So if you think of even simple structures as triangles, you cannot detect them by means of message passing, no matter how deep you go. So this wishful thinking of being able to construct triangles or cliques or more complex graphical structures from nodes and edges is not possible. On the other hand, we have results, let's say, last year's paper from Barabashi that show that certain graph properties, such as graph moments, cannot be computed if the network is not sufficiently deep. So you need certain depth. So it is not clear, actually, what kind of quantities require depth, what kind of quantities cannot be computed at all by means of message passing. So it's still an open question. But returning to the question of scalability, we took this notion to the extreme, doing just one layer of linear diffusion on the graph, and this allows you to pre-compute the diffused features and then apply maybe a few layers of MLP on this. And the pre-computation, actually, the filters can have bigger support. they can incorporate more interesting filters that, for example, can also incorporate directions, can incorporate graph motifs. And we show that in many cases, this architecture achieves, well, if not state-of-the-art results, at least it works on par with much more sophisticated algorithms, but it is extremely fast and extremely scalable.
Okay, so I guess we can take this last question. And so this one is like a local descriptor in images. Do we have a node descriptor or a feature map, or is a feature map calculated from graph before using a DNN for classification?
Right. So that's well, it's a good question. So basically, this is what graph neural networks try to do, right? So you can think of them as a kind of structural encoding. So if you think of the analogy between graph neural networks and color refinement on graphs, the Weisfeiler-Lehman algorithm, that's what they do. So they obviously have a limitation. So certain structures will be indistinguishable because of the way that the algorithm is structured. But you can think of it as an old embedding or as an old description. Yeah. So that's shortly the answer.
Thank you very much for this very nice and informative talk, Michael. And that would bring us to the end of this show. Thank you for your time. And yeah, I'm going to end this thing.